It is one of the peculiarities of my friend Hercule Poirot that he likes his breakfast trays arranged to a degree of symmetry that would have given a drill sergeant pause. The toast is always in 2 stacks of 3 triangles. The coffee pot and cream jug face each other like polite adversaries. The 2 halves of his boiled egg are reunited coquettishly in their little china cup, as though a grievous wrong had never been done them. As for his mustaches, sufficient has been written, though I dare say never enough to satisfy Poirot himself, of their turbined, waxed perfection. On that November morning there was a smurr of rain on the window and a disagreeable film of fog over the street below. I had just unfolded the newspaper and was making poor headway with a column of racing tips when there came a discreet ring at the bell. "Tiens," said Poirot without lifting his eyes from the butter he was spreading with the utmost exactitude. "A visitor before the digestion has commenced. It is barbarous." I went to the door and returned with a square envelope upon a silver salver, which our landlady insisted upon as a point of dignity. The paper was unusually thick, with an understated watermark. The address, Monsieur Hercule Poirot, was written in a neat, angular hand in green ink. There was no stamp. On the back, the flap had been sealed with dark red wax, unmarked by any signet. "A hand-delivered billet," I observed. "Important or theatrical. One never knows which in London." Poirot took the envelope delicately between finger and thumb, as though it were a delicate pastry he hesitated to crush. He studied the seal, the direction of the handwriting, the exactness of the gutters where paper met paper. Only then did he break it with that little rap of the forefinger that I have seen him use on a disobliging suspect. He read once, his eyebrows rising. He read twice, his lips narrowing. Then he passed the single sheet across to me. The letter read, "Monsieur Poirot, at midnight tonight, at the unmasking in Lady Imogen St. Clair's charity masquerade at the Hotel Delphi, one of the company will die. You may prevent it if you will notice the smile that hides a wound. I write because I cannot bear to see the play go on. I sign myself only a friend." I whistled, and not, I trust, entirely for effect. "Well, that is either an impudent hoax or the most monstrous bad taste." "Eh bien, Hastings, you remark the paper. The watermark is of a Mayfair stationer. Expensive. The hand is cultivated and trained not to indulge itself. What you English call kept in. The green ink is an affectation. Yet there is nothing flamboyant in the choice of words. The neatness of the fold, the seal with no device. One does not begin a dance with a flourish and end with a plain bow unless one wishes to say, 'I am particular, but I do not wish to be known.' A woman," I suggested. "Women always like those touches with ink and seals." Poirot shook his head gently. "You are gallant, mon ami, and full of the idées reçues. The letter, it is without the embroidery of the feminine. There is no exclamation, no appeal. It is a statement, almost a ledger entry. Also, the phrase, 'the smile that hides a wound.' It is not sentimental. It is precise. There is the knowledge of psychology there." "Then the writer is a man of letters," I said lightly. "Or a doctor, or a priest, or, oh, dash it, Poirot, we shall be here all day." "For once, your impetuosity is an economy," he returned. He tapped the paper. "What we have, Hastings, a warning that is less a warning than a challenge. You may prevent it, as one throws a glove. The event, midnight, the unmasking at Lady Imogen St. Clair's ball at the Hotel Delphi. The victim, not named. The clue, the smile that hides a wound." He put the tip of his finger upon that line with a satisfaction that was not without relish. "This, Hastings, is very suggestive." "Suggestive of what?" "Vanity," said Poirot complacently. "They know to whom they write." The masquerade unfolds. The Hotel Delphi had been transformed into a glittering stage for Lady Imogen's charity masquerade. Poirot, with his faultless evening clothes and a black half-mask that did nothing to conceal his distinctive mustaches, moved through the crowd with characteristic precision. His keen eyes catalogued every detail: the nervous flutter of Lady Imogen's fan, the way Sir Reuben Drake's jaw tightened when certain names were mentioned, the actress Celia Ray's too bright laughter that seemed to mask deeper currents of emotion. As midnight approached, the atmosphere grew electric with anticipation. The great clock above the dais began its solemn countdown, and on the stroke of 12, as masks were lifted in the grand unmasking ceremony, Sir Reuben Drake swayed and fell forward, a slender letter opener protruding from between his shoulder blades. The anonymous letter's prediction had come to pass, with chilling accuracy. Among the glittering assembly of London society, a killer had struck with surgical precision, leaving Poirot to unravel not just the method, but the deeper psychological truths that had driven someone to murder. Why this opening works. This opening section successfully establishes all the essential Christie elements. Poirot's meticulous character and analytical methods, the closed circle setting of high society, the psychological complexity hinted at in the mysterious letter, and the dramatic fulfillment of the death prediction. The Hastings narration provides the authentic voice that Christie fans recognize, while the masquerade setting creates the perfect atmosphere of hidden identities and concealed motives that will drive the investigation forward. The story is now positioned for Poirot to begin his methodical investigation, interviewing suspects and applying his little grey cells to uncover the truth behind the smile that hides a wound. The moment Sir Reuben Drake collapsed, with that slender blade protruding from between his shoulder blades, the glittering masquerade transformed into something far more sinister. The orchestra's waltz died with a discordant screech of violin strings, and Lady Imogen St. Clair's fan snapped shut with the sharp crack of breaking ivory. For perhaps 3 heartbeats, the ballroom held that peculiar silence that belongs more to the theatre than to life, a silence pregnant with the knowledge that something irrevocable had occurred. Then came the screaming, the immediate chaos. Lady Imogen, resplendent in her Marie Antoinette costume, pressed jeweled hands to her throat and emitted a series of soprano shrieks that would have done credit to the opera house. The other guests fell back in that instinctive way crowds do when confronted with mortality, as though death itself might prove contagious through proximity. "Nobody move." The command came from Inspector Japp, who had materialized with remarkable swiftness from whatever corner of the hotel he had been sampling the champagne. His familiar, bustling figure cut through the crowd, with the authority of Scotland Yard behind him. "This is now a crime scene, ladies and gentlemen." Poirot, meanwhile, had approached the fallen figure with that curious, precise step he adopts when his brain is working at full capacity. He did not run. Poirot never runs. He moved with the deliberate care of a chess master contemplating his next move, his keen eyes absorbing every detail of the scene before him. "Hastings," he murmured to me, his voice barely audible above the rising clamor, "observe the weapon. It is not thrust with passion. See how neat, how surgical the entry, and the face of our victim. There is surprise, yes, but not the surprise of betrayal. Rather, the surprise of one who has miscalculated." Indeed, Sir Reuben's expression, frozen in death, held an almost comical look of astonishment, as though he had been caught in some minor social error rather than struck down by an assassin's blade. Poirot's initial observations. My friend knelt beside the body without touching it, his head cocked at that familiar angle that indicated his little grey cells were working at full capacity. The letter opener, for that is what the weapon proved to be, was of elegant design, silver-handled with an intricate pattern that I recognized as belonging to the hotel's writing desk in the main salon. The choice of weapon, it is significant, Poirot observed quietly. Not a knife brought from outside, not a weapon of premeditation in the usual sense, but rather something taken from the hotel itself, an instrument of writing transformed into an instrument of death. There is symbolism here, mon ami, for those with eyes to see. The positioning of the body was equally telling. Sir Reuben had fallen forward as though he had been turning toward his attacker when the blow was struck. His right hand still clutched a champagne glass, now shattered on the marble floor, while his left hand was extended as though reaching for something, or someone. The suspects revealed. As Inspector Japp began the process of securing the scene, I took note of those who had been closest to Sir Reuben at the moment of the unmasking. They stood now in a loose semicircle around the dais, their carnival masks dangling uselessly, their faces naked with shock and, in some cases, poorly concealed calculation. Mrs. Adela Drake, the victim's wife, stood with her pearls shifting nervously at her throat. Her pale complexion had turned almost translucent, and she swayed slightly as though the sight of her husband's body might cause her to faint. Yet there was something in her eyes, relief, perhaps, that gave me pause. Anthony Drake, Sir Reuben's nephew and heir, pushed back his black and gold domino to reveal a thin face marked by cynical lines, far too mature for his 25 years. "Well," he said with that particular brand of callousness that the young sometimes mistake for sophistication, "I suppose this settles the matter of Uncle's will." Miss Celia Ray, the celebrated actress, maintained her stage presence even in shock. Her professional smile flashed and fled like summer lightning, and her hand went instinctively to arrange her auburn hair to catch the lamplight. Everyone was turning for the unmasking, she said, her voice carrying that trained projection that never quite leaves the theatrical professional. It was such confusion, anyone could have. She stopped, perhaps realizing that her words might implicate herself as much as anyone else. Miss Vera Smallwood, Sir Reuben's secretary, stood apart from the others with the composed demeanor of one accustomed to observing rather than participating. Her round spectacles reflected the ballroom's chandeliers, making her eyes unreadable, but I noticed that her right hand bore a stain of green ink, the same distinctive shade as the anonymous letter that had brought us here. Mr. Lionel Vale, Sir Reuben's business partner, maintained the careful expression of a man accustomed to navigating treacherous financial waters. His iron-grey hair was perfectly groomed despite the evening's excitement, and his hands remained steady as he straightened his evening coat. "We were to meet tomorrow morning about the South Atlantic copper venture," he said quietly. Poor Reuben was most excited about the prospects. Dr. Quentin Morehouse, who had been summoned to examine the body, straightened from his brief inspection with the professional calm of one who had seen death in many forms. "Swift and precise," he announced to Inspector Japp. "The blade has found the heart with surgical accuracy. Death would have been nearly instantaneous." Finally, there was Mr. Lawrence Bligh, the hotel's master of ceremonies, whose florid face had gone pale beneath his askew mask. "The letter opener," he stammered when Poirot inquired. "It's from Lady Imogen's writing desk in the private salon. Only she and the head steward have keys to that room." The anonymous letter's significance. Poirot drew from his breast pocket the green-inked letter that had brought us to this gathering. He held it delicately between finger and thumb as though it were a piece of evidence in a court of law, which indeed it had become. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the subdued murmur of the crowd, "I must inform you that 1 hour before this ball commenced, I received a most unusual communication." He unfolded the letter with theatrical precision. "It warned that at the midnight unmasking, one of your company would die." The effect was electric. Mrs. Drake's hand flew to her throat. Anthony Drake's cynical expression faltered to reveal genuine alarm. Miss Ray's professional composure cracked slightly, and Miss Smallwood's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her evening bag. "The letter," Poirot continued, "spoke of the smile that hides a wound. I confess at the time I thought it perhaps metaphorical. Now I begin to suspect it was quite literal indeed." Setting the stage for investigation, Inspector Japp, who had been listening with growing interest, stepped forward. "Right then, Mr. Poirot, If you've got advance warning of this business, I'd say we're dealing with something rather more complex than a simple crime of passion." He gestured to the assembled suspects. "I'll need formal statements from everyone who was near Sir Reuben at the time of the murder." "If I may suggest, my friend," Poirot interjected gently, "perhaps it would be more profitable to gather our witnesses in a more comfortable setting. The Red Salon, perhaps? Death, it has a way of making people forget the social niceties, but comfort helps the memory, and more importantly, it helps reveal the truth that lies beneath the surface of polite conversation." Lady Imogen, who had regained some of her composure, nodded shakily. "Of course, Mr. Poirot, whatever you think best." She gestured toward a side door. "The Red Salon is just through there. We use it for private dinners." As the small group of principal suspects was ushered toward the more intimate setting, Poirot paused at the threshold and looked back at the scene of the crime. The ballroom, so recently alive with music and laughter, now held only the chalk outline where Sir Reuben Drake had fallen, and the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with something darker, the metallic tang of spilled blood and the bitter aroma of fear. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly. "The stage is set, the players are assembled, and somewhere among them sits a killer who thought themselves clever enough to commit the perfect crime. We shall see, shall we not, whether their confidence was justified?" The doors to the ballroom closed with a soft but final click, sealing away the scene of the crime and trapping the guilty party within our small circle of suspects. The real investigation was about to begin. The Red Salon possessed that peculiar quality of enforced intimacy that makes secrets harder to keep and lies more difficult to maintain. Its crimson velvet drapes and burgundy leather chairs were arranged in Poirot's characteristic semicircle around the marble fireplace, where flames danced with hypnotic regularity. The Belgian detective had positioned himself with mathematical precision near the hearth, where the dancing light cast dramatic shadows across his features while illuminating the faces of his suspects. "It soothed the nerves. The order," Poirot murmured to me, adjusting a footstool by precisely half an inch. "You will observe, Hastings, that people become themselves when symmetry surrounds them, when the tensions of their little dramas are not echoed by chaos in the furniture. The truth has room to breathe." Inspector Japp had posted a constable at the door and taken up station near the sideboard, where an anxious footman had arranged coffee and brandy. I noticed with interest that Poirot declined the brandy in favor of chocolate that had been intended for the ladies, a small detail that spoke to his methodical nature, even in crisis. Lady Imogen St. Clair, the hostess under scrutiny. "We begin with the lady of the house," Poirot announced with courteous authority. "Lady Imogen, if you please." Lady Imogen entered with her composure restored, though her powdered Marie-Antoinette coiffure seemed faintly ridiculous in the sober atmosphere. She touched a lace handkerchief to her lips with nervous precision. "The letter opener, Lady Imogen," Poirot began gently. "It has been identified as belonging to your private writing salon. Perhaps you could enlighten us about access to that room." "Only myself and Mr. Bligh possess keys," she replied promptly. "It is where I compose correspondence and maintain the committee books for our charitable endeavors." Her fingers tightened on the lace. "I did permit Miss Ray to use the room briefly this evening, for privacy to adjust her costume. Mr. Bligh unlocked it at my instruction. Yet the room was secure when you last visited it. This afternoon at 3 o'clock, when I was signing invitation cards. The letter opener was in its proper place on the writing stand." She hesitated. "I cannot imagine who would have taken it, or why." Poirot's eyes glittered with interest. "Most illuminating. You may rest now, Lady Imogen, but please, speak with no one until we have concluded our interviews." Mrs. Adela Drake, the widow's revelation. Mrs. Adela Drake perched on the edge of her chair, like a bird prepared for flight. Her pearls caught the firelight as her breathing quickened, and I observed that her hands trembled as she arranged her evening gloves. "Mrs. Drake," Poirot said with infinite gentleness, "perhaps you would tell us of your husband's recent state of mind. Had anything been troubling him?" The widow's composure cracked like fine porcelain. "Reuben had been receiving letters," she whispered. "Anonymous letters. They began arriving nearly a week ago, and they had made him agitated." This revelation sent a visible ripple through the assembled company. Anthony Drake's eyebrows rose with what appeared to be genuine surprise, while Miss Smallwood's expression remained carefully neutral behind her spectacles. "Anonymous letters," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "And their content, madame?" "Accusations," Mrs. Drake said, her voice gaining strength, "about his business dealings with Mr. Vale, the South Atlantic copper venture. The writer claimed that Reuben had been falsifying geological surveys to attract investors." She looked directly at Lionel Vale, whose face had gone ashen. The letters threatened exposure unless he withdrew from the partnership. "Most interesting," Poirot murmured. "And your husband's response to these accusations?" "He was frightened," she admitted. "More frightened than I had ever seen him. He kept saying he had opened doors that should have remained closed, and that he was beginning to understand the true cost of ambition." Anthony Drake, the heir's candor. Young Anthony Drake lounged in his chair with studied nonchalance, though I detected calculation beneath his casual demeanor. "Uncle Reuben's will," he said with that particular brand of callousness that marks the thoroughly modern young man, "leaves everything to Aunt Adela naturally. However, there is a codicil. Should she predecease him or be found unworthy of inheritance, everything comes to me." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Drake's face had gone white as her pearls, while Vale looked as though he had swallowed something particularly bitter. "And when did you learn of this arrangement?" Poirot inquired mildly. "Last Tuesday. Uncle's solicitor called it a matter of family interest." Anthony's smile held genuine pleasure. "Rather like something from a sensation novel, wouldn't you say?" "Miss Celia Ray, the actress's confession." The celebrated actress had maintained her professional composure throughout the previous testimonies, but I noticed hairline cracks beginning to show in her theatrical mask. "There is something I must confess," she said, addressing Poirot directly. "Sir Reuben had promised to finance my next West End production, but 3 days ago he withdrew his offer." Her hands clenched in her lap. "He claimed his financial situation had become complicated and seemed genuinely distressed, not like a man making excuses, but like one who had discovered something that frightened him." "And your visit to Lady Imogen's private salon this evening?" Poirot asked with deceptive casualness. Miss Ray's stage-trained composure flickered. "To adjust my costume, as I said. But also," she hesitated, "I hope to find some indication of Sir Reuben's true financial position. I searched his coat pockets when he left it in the cloakroom adjacent to the salon." "And what did you discover?" "A telegram from Santiago dated yesterday. Something about copper samples and geological discrepancies. I didn't understand the technical language, but the tone was urgent." Miss Vera Smallwood. The secretary's observations. The secretary had been taking notes throughout the proceedings, her pen moving with mechanical precision. When Poirot turned his attention to her, she looked up with the composed expression of one accustomed to observing rather than being observed. "Miss Smallwood," Poirot said, noting the green ink stain on her right index finger, "you use green ink in your secretarial duties?" "For Sir Reuben's annotations," she replied evenly. "He insisted green made figures more cheerful. It stains terribly." She held up her hand matter-of-factly. "These anonymous letters Mrs. Drake mentioned. Did you perhaps handle them?" For the first time that evening, Miss Smallwood's composure showed a crack. "Sir Reuben instructed me to file them privately, but Mr. Poirot, there was something disturbing about them. The writer knew details about the copper venture that had never been made public. details that only someone with access to our confidential files could have possessed. Mr. Lionel Vale. The partner's dilemma. Vale had maintained his careful composure until Mrs. Drake's revelation about the anonymous letters. Now his iron-grey hair seemed to have aged years in minutes. The geological surveys, he said heavily, were conducted by Hartwell and Associates, London's most reputable firm. Every document has been verified. He paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. However, Reuben had been acting strangely for the past fortnight, requesting additional documentation, wanting to review signed contracts. Yesterday, he suggested postponing the public offering. "You oppose this delay?" Poirot inquired. "I oppose the implications," Vale corrected. If word spread that Sir Reuben Drake had doubts about his own venture, it would destroy not only our partnership, but my reputation in the city. Dr. Morehouse, the medical perspective. Dr. Quentin Morehouse entered with the professional calm of one accustomed to crisis. "Sir Reuben consulted me privately last week," he reported. "Complained of insomnia, nervous tension, and what he described as a persistent feeling of being watched. I prescribed mild sedatives, but his concerns seemed more psychological than physical. He mentioned no specific fears, only cryptic references to having misjudged the character of an associate and worrying that someone knew too much about matters that should remain private. Mr. Lawrence Bly, the missing key. The hotel's master of ceremonies had grown increasingly agitated as the evening's revelations unfolded. His florid face bore a sheen of perspiration despite the room's comfortable temperature. "The letter opener," he said suddenly, as though the words were forced from him, "wasn't simply taken from Lady Imogen's salon. Someone would have needed a key, and there are only 3 copies." He stopped, his face growing pale. "The third key, the master copy from my office, went missing 2 days ago. I thought I had mislaid it, but now—" Poirot's preliminary deductions. As the testimonies concluded, Poirot rose and began that familiar, measured pacing that indicated his mental processes were approaching some preliminary organization of the facts. "So," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the salon, "we have a victim who received anonymous letters threatening to expose fraudulent business dealings. We have a wife who inherits everything, a nephew who benefits if she does not, a business partner whose reputation depends on the venture's success, an actress whose career depended on his patronage, and a secretary with access to confidential information." He paused to fix each suspect with that penetrating stare that seemed to see through polite facades to the truth beneath. "But most intriguing of all," he continued, "we have a murder weapon obtained with a stolen key, anonymous letters written by someone with inside knowledge, and a victim who seemed to expect betrayal, but perhaps not from the quarter from which it came." His eyes glittered in the firelight. "The smile that hides a wound, mes amis. I begin to suspect our correspondent was more literal than poetic." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling fire and the distant sound of London traffic beyond the fog-shrouded windows. Somewhere in this elegant room sat a killer who had planned their crime with meticulous care, but had they been clever enough to account for the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells? "We shall continue tomorrow," Poirot announced with finality. "Tonight, each of you will remain at the hotel under police supervision. The investigation, it has only just begun to reveal its secrets." The grey London dawn crept through the Hotel Delphi's windows with the reluctant persistence of an unwelcome truth. I found Poirot in his sitting room, engaged in that morning ritual of precise arrangement that never failed to fascinate me. His breakfast tray bore the familiar geometry of his ordered mind. 2 triangular pieces of toast arranged in perfect symmetry, his coffee cup positioned at the exact center of its saucer, and beside it all, the anonymous letter in green ink, smoothed flat as though it were a piece of evidence in a court of law, which indeed it had become. "You are early this morning, Hastings," he observed, without looking up from the butter he was spreading with mathematical precision. The little grey cells, they do not sleep well when there are puzzles left unsolved. Before I could respond, there came a brisk knock at the door, and Inspector Japp entered with the air of a man who has spent a sleepless night but emerged victorious. His usually rumpled appearance bore signs of intensive work. Ink stains on his fingers, papers protruding from his coat pocket, and that particular gleam in his eye that indicated he believed himself to be holding winning cards. "Morning, Mr. Poirot. Captain Hastings," he greeted us with barely contained satisfaction. "I think you'll be interested to hear that we've made significant progress in the Drake case. In fact, I'm confident we've got our killer." Japp's case against Vale. Poirot raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow and gestured toward the third chair at his small table. "Indeed, mon ami, pray enlighten us with your discoveries." Japp settled himself with the satisfied air of a cat who has cornered a particularly elusive mouse. "Lionel Vale," he announced. "We've got him dead to rights, and the evidence is as solid as the Bank of England." He withdrew a folded paper from his breast pocket and spread it before us with theatrical precision. "First, we have this receipt from Pilcher and Sons. Keys cut while you wait. Time stamped at 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Found it in Vale's room during our search, tucked away in his dispatch case like he was saving it for a souvenir." "Interesting," Poirot murmured, examining the receipt with his magnifying glass. "And the significance?" "The missing master key from Bligh's office," Japp continued triumphantly. "Vale had a duplicate made. But that's not all. We found a stick of sealing wax in his belongings with a clear impression of the original key. He'd taken a mold, you see, probably when Bligh wasn't looking." The inspector's voice gained momentum as he warmed to his theme. "The night porter swears Vale came down to the corridor where Lady Imogen's salon is located not once, but twice yesterday evening. First time was before dinner, probably to plant the letter opener where he could retrieve it easily. Second time was just 10 minutes before the unmasking ceremony." Poirot's fingers drummed silently against his coffee cup, a sure sign that his mind was working at full capacity. "And the motive, Inspector?" "The telegram from Santiago," Japp said, producing another document. "We found it in Vale's pocketbook, not Sir Reuben's as Miss Ray claimed. It confirms what the anonymous letters alleged. The geological surveys were fraudulent. Vale's reputation in the city, his entire financial empire, was built on this South Atlantic copper venture. If Sir Reuben had exposed the fraud, Vale would have been ruined." Poirot's methodical skepticism. My friend studied the evidence with that peculiar intensity he reserves for problems that do not quite satisfy his sense of logical order. After several minutes of silence, he looked up with an expression that I had learned to recognize as profound skepticism. "The evidence, it is most comprehensive, Japp," he said carefully. "Almost too comprehensive. Would you not agree?" "What do you mean by that?" Japp demanded, his satisfaction beginning to show cracks around the edges. "Consider the psychology, mon ami. We have a man of business, a financier who has built his career on careful calculation and measured risk. Such a man, if he wished to silence Sir Reuben permanently, would surely choose a method more discreet. A quiet meeting, perhaps, or an arrangement that would appear accidental. But this—" Poirot gestured toward the hotel around us. "This is theatre, Japp. This is the grand gesture, the dramatic revelation at the moment of unmasking. Does this speak to you of the mind of a cautious businessman?" "Desperate men do desperate things," Japp retorted, though with less conviction than before. "Précisément. But observe the evidence you have collected. A receipt kept in his dispatch case. Would a guilty man preserve such an incriminating document? A mold of sealing wax left where it could be easily discovered. These are not the actions of a desperate man covering his tracks, Japp. These are the actions of a man who has been, how do you say, framed." The discovery in the cloakroom. "Come," Poirot said, rising with sudden decision. "I wish to examine once more the scene of our drama. There are details that require clarification." We made our way through the hotel's corridors, past the sealed ballroom where Sir Reuben had met his end, to the small cloakroom adjacent to Lady Imogen's private salon. The room bore the musty scent of expensive fabrics and the lingering traces of last night's perfumes and pomades. Poirot moved through the space with his characteristic precision, examining coat hooks, checking the arrangement of abandoned evening accessories, and paying particular attention to the masks that had been discarded after the fateful unmasking ceremony. "Ah," he said suddenly, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction that indicated a significant discovery. From among the collection of silk and velvet masks, he withdrew one bearing a painted smile, the sort of theatrical grin that children find both fascinating and frightening. "Observe, mes amis." The mask itself was unremarkable, one of many provided by the hotel for guests who had arrived without their own. But on the inner edge, near where it would have rested against the wearer's temple, was a small, dark smear that was clearly not grease paint. "Flesh-colored paste," Poirot announced after a careful examination, "mixed with tincture of benzoin, the sort of theatrical makeup used to conceal small wounds or to secure bandages that must remain hidden beneath a social facade." "The smile that hides a wound," I breathed, remembering the cryptic phrase from the anonymous letter. "Precisely, Hastings. Our letter writer was not speaking in metaphors, but in quite literal terms. Someone at last night's masquerade was concealing a physical wound, and they chose a mask with a painted smile to ensure that their deception remained complete." The psychological game begins. Japp examined the mask with growing interest, though I could see his confidence in the case against Vale beginning to waver. "So you're saying someone else was injured, but none of our suspects showed any signs of wounds during questioning. Which suggests, mon ami, that our killer is not merely clever, but also possessed of considerable theatrical skill. The ability to conceal pain, to maintain a perfect social facade while harboring both physical and emotional wounds. This speaks to a very particular type of personality." Poirot began his familiar pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes focused on some internal vision that was invisible to the rest of us. "Consider our cast of characters, Japp. Mrs. Drake, who inherits everything but seemed almost relieved by her husband's death. Anthony Drake, whose cynical youth masks what deeper currents? Miss Ray, whose profession requires her to convincingly portray emotions she may not feel. Miss Smallwood, whose quiet efficiency conceals what personal investment in her employer's affairs." "You're suggesting the secretary after all?" I asked. "I suggest nothing yet, Hastings. But I observe that our killer has made one crucial error. They have assumed that physical evidence would be sufficient to convict an innocent man, while believing that psychological evidence would be insufficient to expose a guilty one." His eyes glittered with that particular satisfaction that indicated his little gray cells were approaching a significant conclusion. "They have underestimated the persistence of methodical investigation." The net begins to close. As we returned to the red salon where the other suspects waited, Poirot paused at the threshold with that theatrical sense of timing that never failed to command attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled company, "I must inform you that Inspector Japp has made an arrest in the matter of Sir Reuben Drake's murder. Mr. Lionel Vale has been charged based on what appears to be overwhelming physical evidence." The reaction was immediate and telling. Mrs. Drake's hand flew to her throat in apparent shock, though I noticed her eyes held a calculating gleam. Anthony Drake's cynical expression faltered momentarily before reasserting itself. Miss Ray's professional composure remained intact, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her evening bag. Miss Smallwood showed no reaction whatsoever, maintaining that secretarial mask of efficient neutrality. "However," Poirot continued, his voice carrying clearly through the salon's charged atmosphere, "I find myself troubled by certain inconsistencies in the evidence. The case, as you English say, is not quite as cut and dried as it might appear. He withdrew the theatrical mask from his coat pocket, holding it delicately between finger and thumb. This mask was worn by someone at last night's masquerade, someone who needed to conceal not merely their identity, but also a physical wound. The smile that hides a wound, as our anonymous correspondent so precisely expressed it. Setting the stage. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of London traffic beyond the hotel's windows. I could sense the tension in the room like a physical presence, as though the very air had grown thick with unspoken secrets and carefully maintained deceptions. The investigation, Poirot announced with finality, is far from concluded. Mr. Vale may have been arrested, but the true killer remains among us, watching, waiting, and perhaps even enjoying what they believe to be their successful misdirection of justice. He moved to his characteristic position near the fireplace, where the dancing flames cast dramatic shadows across his features while illuminating the faces of his suspects. Tomorrow, we shall delve deeper into the psychological truths that lie beneath the surface of this elegant deception. For tonight, I suggest you all rest well, though I suspect that for one among you, sleep will prove as elusive as the truth they seek to conceal. As the suspects filed out of the salon, each lost in their own thoughts and fears, I reflected that Poirot had successfully accomplished what Christie's detective always managed at this stage of an investigation. He had rejected the obvious solution while simultaneously tightening the psychological pressure on the real killer. The first false lead had been exposed, and the true psychological game was about to begin in earnest. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said quietly as the last suspect departed. "Tomorrow we shall see whether our killer's confidence in their theatrical abilities was justified, or whether the truth will prove stronger than even the most carefully constructed performance." The stage was set for the next act of this deadly drama, and somewhere among our suspects, a murderer was beginning to realize that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were not so easily deceived by convenient evidence and obvious solutions. The grey London morning settled over the Hotel Delphi with the weight of unresolved secrets, but Hercule Poirot moved through his morning routine with the methodical precision of a chess master contemplating his next several moves. I found him in the small morning room he had commandeered, arranging what appeared to be an elaborate tea service with mathematical exactitude. "You have that look again, Poirot," I observed, noting the particular gleam in his eye that indicated his little grey cells were working at full capacity. The look of a man who has discovered something significant but chooses to keep it to himself. "Ah, mon ami, you begin to understand the psychology of investigation," he replied, adjusting a teacup by precisely half an inch. "The truth, it must be coaxed from its hiding place like a shy bird from its nest. One does not capture it with nets and noise, but with patience and the proper inducements." I noticed that he had arranged the room with particular care. The temperature was uncomfortably warm, thanks to a blazing fire despite the mild day. Near the writing desk, he had placed a small silver tray containing several items. A bottle labeled Friar's Balsam in Lady Imogen's elegant script, a collection of theatrical makeup supplies, and most intriguingly, a shallow dish of fine sand for blotting ink. The gathering of minds. At Poirot's request, Inspector Japp had arranged for our remaining suspects to join us for what was diplomatically termed a courtesy discussion over tea. The gathering would serve multiple purposes, maintaining the appearance of civilized social interaction while providing Poirot with the controlled environment he required for his psychological observations. Mrs. Adela Drake arrived first, her widow's composure intact, but showing hairline cracks around the edges. She moved with the careful precision of someone who fears that any sudden motion might shatter her carefully maintained facade. Anthony Drake followed, his cynical smile firmly in place, though I noticed his eyes held a restless quality that suggested underlying anxiety. Miss Celia Ray entered with her professional stage presence fully engaged, every gesture calculated for maximum effect. Yet even her trained composure could not entirely conceal a certain brittleness, as though she were performing a role that had grown too heavy for her to sustain. Miss Vera Smallwood took her customary position slightly apart from the others, her round spectacles reflecting the firelight and making her expression unreadable. Mr. Lawrence Bligh completed our assembly, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by the hangdog expression of a man who had discovered that his professional competence was being questioned in the most serious possible terms. The experiment begins. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, pouring tea with exquisite care, "we gather not for formal interrogation, but for civilized discourse. The events of last evening have left us all somewhat discomposed. Perhaps a comfortable setting will help restore our collective equilibrium." He offered each person a cup with ritualistic precision, noting their reactions with the intensity of a scientist observing laboratory specimens. The warmth of the room was beginning to affect everyone differently. Mrs. Drake dabbed discreetly at her temples with a lace handkerchief, while Anthony Drake had loosened his collar slightly. "The anonymous letter that brought me here," Poirot continued conversationally, "contained a most intriguing phrase. The smile that hides a wound. I confess, I initially interpreted this metaphorically, but recent discoveries suggest a more literal interpretation may be warranted." He moved to the writing desk and lifted the bottle of Friar's Balsam. Benzoin tincture, commonly used in theatrical circles to secure prosthetic pieces or to heal minor cuts that must be concealed during performance. Lady Imogen mentioned that she uses it for her throat, but Dr. Morehouse confirmed that it has many cosmetic applications. Individual psychological pressure. The effect of Poirot's casual mention of the benzoin was immediate and telling. Miss Ray's hand moved instinctively toward her left temple before she caught herself and transformed the gesture into an elegant adjustment of her hair. Mrs. Drake's breathing became slightly more rapid, while Miss Smallwood's expression remained carefully neutral, perhaps too neutral for genuine indifference. "Miss Ray," Poirot said with deceptive gentleness, "as a professional actress, you would be familiar with the techniques for concealing minor injuries during performance. A cut from a prop, perhaps, or a scrape from a costume fitting?" "One learns such skills by necessity," she replied, her trained voice carrying clearly despite an almost imperceptible tremor. "The show, as they say, must go on regardless of minor inconveniences." "Indeed. And you would know, for instance, how to use theatrical adhesive to secure a bandage beneath a mask, how to blend makeup to conceal the edges of such concealment." Miss Ray's professional composure flickered momentarily. "Such techniques are within the range of any competent performer." Poirot turned his attention to Mrs. Drake with the same gentle intensity. "Madame, you mentioned that your husband had been receiving anonymous letters for nearly a week. Did these communications suggest that the writer possessed intimate knowledge of his business affairs?" "More than intimate," Mrs. Drake replied, her voice gaining strength. "The writer knew details that should have been known only to Reuben, Mr. Vale, and perhaps—" she glanced toward Miss Smallwood. "Perhaps someone with access to confidential files." "The physical evidence." "Mr. Bligh," Poirot said, turning to the hotel manager with sudden sharpness, "you mentioned yesterday that you provided Miss Ray with access to Lady Imogen's private salon. Did she make any unusual requests during that visit?" Bligh's florid face grew pale. "Well, now that you mention it, she did ask for a small bottle of antiseptic and a bandage. Said she'd scraped her hand on a loose nail backstage while adjusting her costume. I thought nothing of it at the time. These theatrical folk are always having little accidents with their elaborate get-ups." The silence that followed this revelation was charged with significance. Miss Ray's composure showed visible cracks, while the other suspects exchanged meaningful glances. Poirot moved closer to the fireplace, where the increased heat made the scent of benzoin more noticeable. The mask found in the cloakroom, he continued methodically, bore traces of theatrical adhesive mixed with benzoin tincture. The combination suggests someone who required both the concealment of a wound and the security to ensure that concealment would not fail during an evening of social interaction. The tightening net. Anthony Drake's cynical smile had faded entirely. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Poirot, that someone among us was injured during the commission of murder? That seems rather careless for a premeditated crime." "On the contrary, Mr. Drake, I suggest that someone among us sustained an injury while preparing for murder, perhaps while handling an unfamiliar weapon or while practicing the precise motion required to strike a fatal blow." Poirot's eyes glittered with that particular satisfaction that indicated his deductions were approaching their target. The letter opener from Lady Imogen's salon is an elegant weapon, but not one designed for violence. It would require careful handling to avoid self-injury. Miss Smallwood spoke for the first time since the gathering began. "Mr. Poirot, you seem to be suggesting that the physical evidence against Mr. Vale was deliberately planted. That would require considerable forethought and intimate knowledge of his personal habits." "Precisely, mademoiselle. It would require someone who understood not only Mr. Vale's routines and possessions, but also the psychology of police investigation. Someone who could predict how evidence would be interpreted and by whom." The psychological climax. Poirot returned to his position near the fireplace, where the dancing flames cast dramatic shadows across his features while illuminating the faces of his suspects. The increased heat had made the scent of benzoin more pronounced, and I noticed that several of our companions had grown visibly uncomfortable. The anonymous letters, the planted evidence, the carefully timed murder at the moment of unmasking, all these elements suggest a mind that understands both human psychology and theatrical effect. Someone who could plan not only a crime, but also the investigation that would follow. He paused, allowing his words to settle in the charged atmosphere of the room. But such elaborate planning requires one crucial element that our killer perhaps did not fully consider: the physical evidence of their own participation. A wound that must be concealed, antiseptic that must be obtained, theatrical skills that must be employed. Miss Ray's professional composure finally cracked completely. "Mr. Poirot, I must protest." "You must protest nothing, mademoiselle, except perhaps the assumption that your considerable theatrical skills could deceive the methodical investigation of the truth." Poirot's voice carried a note of finality that indicated the psychological game was approaching its conclusion. The smile that hides a wound, both literal and metaphorical. The performance that conceals the performer. The mask that reveals more than it conceals. The chapter's resolution. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Poirot raised his hand with characteristic authority. "But we shall not conclude our investigation in haste, mes amis. The truth, like a fine wine, must be allowed to breathe before it can be properly appreciated." He moved toward the door with that sense of theatrical timing that never failed to command attention. "Tomorrow we shall gather once more, all of us, including the unfortunate Mr. Vale, who I believe will be released from custody before evening. The final act of our drama requires the presence of all players, including those who have been temporarily miscast." As our suspects filed out of the morning room, each lost in their own thoughts and fears, I observed that Poirot had successfully accomplished what Christie's detective always managed at this stage. He had applied precise psychological pressure while revealing just enough to tighten the net around his quarry without premature resolution. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly as the last suspect departed. "The psychological game has served its purpose. Tomorrow we shall see whether our killer's confidence in their theatrical abilities was justified, or whether the truth will prove stronger than even the most carefully constructed performance." The morning room fell silent except for the crackling fire and the distant sounds of London beyond the hotel's windows. Somewhere among our suspects, A murderer was beginning to realize that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were not so easily deceived by elaborate misdirection and convenient evidence. The final gathering would reveal all, but the psychological foundation had been carefully laid. The grey November morning settled over the Hotel Delphi with the weight of unresolved secrets. I found Poirot in his temporary sitting room, engaged in that familiar ritual of precise arrangement that indicated his little grey cells were working at maximum capacity. The theatrical mask with its telltale benzoin stain lay on the side table like a silent accusation, while beside it, the anonymous letter in green ink had been smoothed flat with mathematical precision. "You have that look again, Poirot," I observed, noting the particular gleam in his eye that suggested significant developments were imminent. The look of a man who has set a trap and is waiting to see what manner of creature will walk into it. "Ah, mon ami, you begin to understand the psychology of investigation," he replied, adjusting his coffee cup by precisely half an inch. "Yesterday's gathering in the Red Salon was not merely an interrogation. It was a test. I revealed just enough to make our killer realize that their carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel." Before I could inquire further, there came a sharp rap at the door, and Inspector Japp entered with the harried expression of a man whose supposedly solved case had developed uncomfortable complications. The discovery in Lady Imogen's salon. "Mr. Poirot," Japp announced without preamble, "there's been another incident. Lady Imogen's private salon has been burgled during the night. Professional job. No forced entry, but the place has been thoroughly searched. We found Lady Imogen in a state of considerable distress, her usual Dresden china, composure cracked around the edges. The salon presented a scene of careful disorder, drawers opened, papers scattered, but nothing destroyed with violence. This was the work of someone seeking specific information, not a common thief interested in valuables." "The writing desk," Poirot observed, moving through the room with characteristic precision, "has been the primary focus. Yet observe, Hastings, the silver letter opener set remains untouched, the small jewelry box is undisturbed. Our burglar sought papers, not treasure." Lady Imogen wrung her hands nervously. "I cannot understand what they might have wanted. There was nothing of value, only correspondence, charity committee records, and—" She paused, her face growing pale. "And a sealed envelope that Sir Reuben asked me to keep secure. He said it contained documents that must not fall into the wrong hands." "This envelope?" Poirot inquired gently. "It is now missing?" "Yes," she whispered, "along with several letters I had received from various committee members, written in that distinctive green ink that seems so popular these days." The blotter's secret. Poirot's attention fixed immediately upon the writing desk's green Morocco blotter, which lay at a slight angle to its usual position. With that delicate intensity, he brings to clues that speak more of minds than matter. He lifted the blotter and examined its undersurface with his magnifying glass. "Hastings, be so good as to fetch that small hand mirror from Lady Imogen's vanity," he instructed. When I complied, he pressed the blotter against the glass with careful precision. To my astonishment, reversed words sprang into legible relief, ghostly impressions of ink that had been absorbed by the blotter, now revealed through reflection. The handwriting was neat and controlled, each letter formed with schoolroom exactness. Notice the smile that hides a wound. And beneath it, the familiar signature. "I sign myself only, a friend." "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, his eyes glittering with satisfaction. "Our anonymous correspondent has been revealed by their own careful penmanship. The blotter, it remembers what the writer wished to forget. Miss Smallwood's revelation." Inspector Japp let out a low whistle of appreciation. "So the anonymous letters were written right here, in Lady Imogen's salon. But who had access?" "That, mon ami, is a question we must explore with great delicacy," Poirot replied, carefully securing the blotter in his coat pocket. "But first, I believe we should speak with Miss Smallwood. Her secretarial training would make her most observant of such details as handwriting and paper quality. We found Miss Vera Smallwood in the hotel's morning room, but her usual composed efficiency showed signs of strain. Her round spectacles seemed to magnify the anxiety in her eyes, and I noticed that her right hand bore the familiar stain of green ink, more pronounced than usual. "Miss Smallwood," Poirot began with infinite gentleness, "you mentioned yesterday that Sir Reuben had been receiving anonymous letters. Were you perhaps familiar with their contents?" For the first time since our acquaintance began, Miss Smallwood's secretarial composure cracked completely. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must confess something that I should have revealed earlier. I was the author of those letters." The silence that followed was charged with significance. Japp's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline, while I felt the familiar thrill that accompanies a major breakthrough in one of Poirot's investigations. The secretary's confession. Sir Reuben had become involved in something far more dangerous than a simple business fraud, Miss Smallwood continued, her words gaining strength as she unburdened herself of the secret. The South Atlantic copper venture was merely the visible portion of a much larger deception. Someone had been using Sir Reuben's reputation and connections to establish a network of shell companies, funneling money through Swiss accounts, creating an elaborate web of financial manipulation. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, leather-bound ledger. I kept a parallel record of all transactions, all correspondence, all the details that didn't appear in the official books. Sir Reuben was being blackmailed, Mr. Poirot. Someone was forcing him to participate in schemes that grew more elaborate and dangerous with each passing month. Poirot examined the ledger with intense interest, his eyes scanning the neat columns of figures and cryptic notations. "And these anonymous letters you sent to Sir Reuben? I was trying to warn him, to give him the courage to break free from whoever was controlling him, but I dared not sign my name. I feared for my own safety if the true architect of this conspiracy discovered my knowledge." The psychological web tightens. "The letter you sent to me," Poirot said thoughtfully. "Predicting Sir Reuben's death, you suspected violence would result from his attempts to extricate himself?" Miss Smallwood nodded miserably. He had been growing more desperate, more frightened. He spoke of closing doors that should have remained closed, and seemed to believe that someone close to him was involved in the conspiracy. "When I learned of the masquerade ball, I feared it would provide the perfect opportunity for someone to silence him permanently. Yet you could not identify this mysterious controller?" Sir Reuben was careful never to mention names in my presence. "But I observed his behavior, his correspondence, his appointments. The pattern suggested someone with intimate knowledge of his business affairs, his social connections, his personal habits. Someone who could manipulate him through a combination of financial pressure and emotional leverage. The trap springs." Poirot rose and began his familiar measured pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "So we have established that Miss Smallwood was our anonymous correspondent, motivated by loyalty to her employer and fear of a larger conspiracy. But this morning's burglary suggests that someone else knew of her activities and sought to eliminate the evidence she had gathered." He paused, fixing each of us with that penetrating stare. "The question now becomes, who among our suspects possessed the knowledge, the opportunity, and the desperation necessary to commit not one, but two crimes in order to protect their secret?" Inspector Japp straightened with renewed purpose. "Right then. I'll have the remaining suspects gathered in the Red Salon. If someone's been playing us for fools with planted evidence and elaborate misdirection, it's time to sort them out properly." The chapter's climactic preparation. As we prepared to confront our assembled suspects, Poirot drew me aside for a moment of private consultation. His expression held that particular intensity that indicated his deductions were approaching their final form. "Hastings," he said quietly, "we now possess the three crucial elements necessary to expose our killer. We have the physical evidence of the benzoin-stained mask, revealing someone who concealed a wound during the masquerade. We have the psychological evidence of elaborate misdirection, indicating someone with both theatrical skills and intimate knowledge of criminal investigation. And now we have the financial evidence of a conspiracy far more complex than simple business fraud. He tapped the ledger thoughtfully. Our killer is someone who could manipulate Sir Reuben through blackmail, who possessed the skills to frame Mr. Vale convincingly, and who was desperate enough to risk a second crime to eliminate the evidence of their true identity. The smile that hides a wound, mon ami, both literal and metaphorical. Setting the final stage. As we made our way toward the red salon where our final confrontation would take place, Poirot paused at the threshold with that sense of theatrical timing that never failed to command attention. "The investigation," he announced to me with quiet satisfaction, "has revealed its essential truth. Our killer believed they could control not only the crime, but also the investigation that followed. They underestimated both the persistence of methodical detection and the tendency of elaborate deceptions to collapse under their own complexity." The hotel's corridors seemed to hold their breath as we approached the final gathering. Somewhere among our suspects sat a killer who had committed murder to protect a financial conspiracy, framed an innocent man with meticulous care, and burgled a private salon to eliminate evidence of their true identity. But they had not counted on the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells, nor on the courage of a loyal secretary who had risked everything to preserve the truth. The stage was set for the final revelation, and the psychological game that had begun with an anonymous letter in green ink was about to reach its dramatic conclusion in the elegant confines of the Hotel Delphi's red salon. The grey November morning settled over the Hotel Delphi with the weight of unresolved justice, but there was a different quality to the atmosphere, the electric tension that precedes a storm's breaking. I found Poirot in his temporary quarters, engaged in that familiar ritual of precise arrangement that indicated his little grey cells were approaching their final calculations. Inspector Japp arrived with the reluctant bearing of a man forced to admit error. "You were right about Vale, Mr. Poirot," he said without preamble, his usual bluster replaced by grudging respect. His alibi for the burglary checked out solid, and his solicitor raised such hell about planted evidence that we had to release him. He's back at the hotel now, demanding apologies and threatening lawsuits. "The truth, mon ami, has a way of asserting itself despite our preferences," Poirot observed, adjusting his coffee cup with mathematical precision. "And the burglary itself?" "Professional job. Nothing of obvious value taken. Just papers, as you predicted. Lady Imogen's beside herself about some sealed envelope Sir Reuben gave her for safekeeping. Miss Smallwood insists her private ledger was among the stolen items." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "A most selective thief, would you not agree?" The physical reconstruction. The red salon had been transformed into a theatre of justice, its crimson walls seeming to pulse with expectancy. There is, I have observed, a particular quality to the air before one of Poirot's orchestrated confrontations. The room feels like a taut violin string, just on the edge of singing. Our assembled suspects took their places with varying degrees of unease. Lionel Vale, released but shaken, bore the hollow-eyed expression of a man who had glimpsed the abyss of wrongful conviction. Mrs. Adela Drake maintained her widow's composure, though her pallor had settled into something more permanent. Anthony Drake's cynical facade showed visible cracks, while Miss Celia Ray held herself with the rigid control of an actress between curtain and cue. "We shall, if you please, reconstruct the scene," Poirot announced, arranging chairs with characteristic precision. "Not the horror, but the movement. The psychology of position, it is everything." He placed markers on the carpet indicating where each person had stood at the moment of the unmasking. Mrs. Drake here, Mr. Anthony there, Mademoiselle Ray to the left, Mr. Vale opposite, Miss Smallwood by the pillar. The victim stood here, back to the room. As each person moved to their designated position, I felt that peculiar power of Poirot's method, how the shapes of bodies in space could call back the crucial moment with startling clarity. "Dr. Morehouse," Poirot said as the physician entered, "you observed that the blade entered between the shoulder blades, angled slightly downward. From the victim's position and the wound's trajectory, what can you deduce about the attacker?" "The strike came from the left rear," Morehouse replied thoughtfully. "Close proximity, quick and precise. Either a left-handed blow or a right hand forced to strike awkwardly from that angle." The financial web exposed, Poirot nodded with satisfaction and moved to a side table where he had arranged several items with theatrical precision. The benzoin-stained mask, Miss Smallwood's recovered ledger, and most intriguingly, a jeweler's loupe of the type used to examine precious stones or detect forged documents. The murder of Sir Reuben was not a crime of passion, mes amis, but the desperate conclusion of an elaborate financial conspiracy spanning 3 years. He opened the ledger with reverent care. Miss Smallwood's meticulous records reveal a web of shell companies, Swiss bank accounts, and fraudulent mining ventures totaling nearly £500,000. The effect was electric. Vale's face went ashen, while Mrs. Drake's hand flew to her throat. Anthony Drake's cynical composure cracked visibly. The South Atlantic copper venture was merely the visible portion of this iceberg of deception. Beneath it lay a structure requiring someone with intimate knowledge of Sir Reuben's business affairs, his personal vulnerabilities, and the emotional leverage necessary to ensure his cooperation. Poirot lifted the jeweler's loupe, examining it with delicate intensity. This instrument, found among the effects of one of our suspects, is designed to detect the subtle differences between genuine and forged documents. It suggests someone with professional expertise in examining financial instruments, someone who would know precisely how to create convincing forgeries. The hidden clue. Revealed. From his coat pocket, Poirot withdrew a small folded paper I had not seen before. The burglary of Lady Imogen's salon was a desperate attempt to retrieve incriminating evidence. However, our thief overlooked one crucial detail. He unfolded the paper with theatrical precision, revealing what appeared to be a rubbing taken from the indented surface of writing paper. The impression left on the writing pad beneath the stolen documents. When properly revealed, it shows not only the familiar green ink of the anonymous letters, but also a series of calculations and authorizations that match the entries in Miss Smallwood's ledger. The silence was profound. I could sense the psychological pressure building like steam in a kettle. These impressions reveal the signature of the person who authorized the fraudulent transactions, a signature that appears on documents dating back nearly 3 years. Someone who possessed the legal authority to act on Sir Reuben's behalf in financial matters. The psychological portrait. Poirot began his familiar measured pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. Our killer possessed a unique combination of skills, financial expertise, psychological manipulation, theatrical ability, and intimate knowledge of criminal investigation procedures. They could forge documents convincingly, plant evidence skillfully, and maintain a perfect social facade while harboring murderous intent. He paused before the fireplace, where the dancing flames cast dramatic shadows across his features. The anonymous letter spoke of the smile that hides a wound, not merely metaphorical, but literal. Someone at the masquerade was concealing both a physical injury sustained during the crime's preparation and the deeper psychological wound of guilt and desperation. Miss Ray's composure finally showed visible cracks. "Mr. Poirot, I must explain about the benzoin." "You need explain nothing, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "Your injury was sustained while searching Sir Reuben's belongings, not while committing murder. The benzoin traces on the mask tell a different story, of someone who required both concealment and security during an evening of social interaction." The net tightens. Vale, though no longer suspected of murder, looked profoundly shaken by the revelation of the financial conspiracy. His indignation had evaporated. replaced by palpable terror that suggested his involvement, if not in murder, then certainly in the fraudulent schemes. The person who murdered Sir Reuben, Poirot continued relentlessly, was someone who could access his accounts, forge his authorization, and manipulate his business relationships without arousing immediate suspicion. Someone whose outward facade of loyalty and competence concealed a ruthless, calculating nature. Mrs. Drake's widow's weeds seemed to hang more heavily upon her frame, while Anthony Drake had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained cynicism. The psychological pressure had reached its peak. The burglary was committed by someone who knew exactly what documents to seek and where to find them. Someone familiar with Lady Imogen's salon, with the hotel's routines, with the precise location of the evidence that could expose their true identity. The chapter's climactic resolution. Inspector Japp had straightened with renewed purpose, his hand moving instinctively toward his handcuffs. The atmosphere in the salon was charged with the electricity of approaching revelation. Tomorrow, Poirot announced with that sense of theatrical timing that never failed to command attention, we shall gather for the final confrontation. The hidden clue has been revealed, the financial conspiracy exposed, and the psychological profile of our killer established beyond doubt. He moved toward the door with characteristic authority. Tonight, I suggest you all consider carefully the choices that have brought us to this moment. For one among you, the elaborate performance is nearly over, and the final curtain is about to fall. As our suspects filed out of the red salon, each lost in their own thoughts and fears, I reflected that Poirot had successfully accomplished what Christie's detective always managed at this crucial stage. He had revealed the essential truth while maintaining the suspense necessary for a dramatic final confrontation. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly as the last suspect departed. "The hidden clue has served its purpose. Tomorrow we shall see whether our killer's confidence in their theatrical abilities was justified, or whether the methodical application of logic will prove stronger than even the most carefully constructed deception." The afternoon light faded beyond the salon's windows, and somewhere among our suspects, a murderer was beginning to understand that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had uncovered not merely a crime of passion, but a conspiracy of such scope and complexity that its exposure would reverberate through London's most respectable circles. The stage was set for the final revelation, but the essential foundation had been laid through methodical investigation and psychological insight. The grey November evening settled over the Hotel Delphi with the weight of approaching revelation, but there was a different quality to the atmosphere, the electric tension that precedes a storm's breaking. I found Poirot in the small morning room he had commandeered, engaged in that familiar ritual of precise arrangement that indicated his little grey cells were approaching their final calculations. "You have that look again, Poirot," I observed, noting the particular gleam in his eye that suggested significant developments were imminent. The look of a man who has set a trap and is waiting to see what manner of creature will walk into it. "Précisément, mon ami," he replied, adjusting a small vase of white chrysanthemums by precisely half an inch. "Tonight, we shall discover whether our serpent will strike again when cornered, or whether the wisdom of self-preservation will overcome the desperation of exposure." Inspector Japp arrived with the reluctant bearing of a man forced to admit error. "You were right about Vale, Mr. Poirot," he said without preamble. His alibi for the time frame checked out solid, and the planted evidence was too convenient by half. We've released him, though he's threatening lawsuits and demanding apologies. "The truth, mon ami, has a way of asserting itself despite our preferences," Poirot observed. "And now, I believe, we shall give our true killer one final opportunity to reveal themselves through action rather than words." The Palm Court Stratagem. The Palm Court, with its tall fronds and discreet lamps, possessed that peculiar quality of enforced intimacy that makes secrets harder to keep and lies more difficult to maintain. At this evening hour, it was nearly deserted save for a pianist caressing a melancholy tune that seemed to echo the hotel's recent tragedy. Presently, Poirot explained as we took our positions behind a decorative screen, "There will be a note delivered to at Miss Smallwood's room. It will be signed 'A Friend' and will propose a meeting her, claiming that new evidence has come to light that threatens her safety." "You mean to use Miss Smallwood as bait?" I protested, alarmed by the implications. "But no, Hastings. I am humane," Poirot replied with gentle reproach. "We use suggestion only, a silhouette, a carefully arranged deception." In the half-light at the far end of the court, a cloaked figure sat with its back presented, the tilt of the head unmistakably resembling Miss Smallwood's prim carriage. In reality, it was a chambermaid of similar stature, promised a generous gratuity and instructed to depart at the first sign of approach. The serpent's strike. What followed happened with a suddenness that stole my breath. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the service entrance and moved with the confident stealth of someone intimately familiar with the hotel's layout. The collar was turned up, the head lowered, but I noticed immediately that one gloved hand rested on the balustrade with unmistakable left-handed positioning. The attack, when it came, was swift and calculated. The figure approached the seated decoy from behind and to the left, raising their hand in a motion that would have delivered a precise blow to the base of the skull, the same angle that had proven fatal to Sir Reuben Drake. At Poirot's sharp whistle, the chambermaid sprang aside with admirable agility. Inspector Japp surged forward with a bellow, but the attacker twisted like a cat, knocked his arm away with a practiced left-handed defensive movement, and fled through the service corridors with such certainty of direction that it was clear we were dealing with someone thoroughly familiar with the hotel's hidden passages. The crucial evidence. Though our quarry escaped, they had not done so without leaving a trace. Near the fountain where the attack had been attempted, Poirot discovered a fountain pen that had fallen during the struggle, slim and elegant, with a chased silver barrel that caught the lamplight. "Observe, mes amis," Poirot said, examining the pen with his magnifying glass. "An oblique nib cut at a distinctive slant and broader on one side. This is specifically designed for left-handed writers who wish their lines to be neat rather than smudged by the natural motion of their hand." More significantly, there was a smear of green ink along the nib, the same distinctive shade that had appeared in the anonymous letters and on Miss Smallwood's stained fingers. "The nib itself tells a story," Poirot continued, pointing to a small burr on the lower right edge. "This wear pattern is consistent with left-handed writing over an extended period. Our anonymous letter writer and our attacker are one and the same, and they are decidedly left-handed. The behavioral revelations. As word of the evening's excitement spread through the hotel, our suspects gathered in the main lounge with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. What proved most illuminating were the unconscious behaviors that stress and surprise revealed. Anthony Drake entered smoking and, with the casual assurance of habit, flicked ash into a decorative fern with his left hand, a gesture so natural that it clearly represented his dominant preference. Mrs. Drake appeared with a black chiffon handkerchief pressed to her lips, but I noticed she held her teacup with her right hand while her left worried unconsciously at a small tear in the fabric. Miss Celia Ray maintained her professional composure, but her graceful adjustment of her evening gloves revealed a telling detail. She used her right hand to smooth the left glove, while her dominant left hand remained relaxed and natural. Mr. Lawrence Bligh emerged from the direction of the service corridors, shifting his keys from pocket to pocket with unconscious left-handed dexterity. The psychological profile emerges. The evidence now points to a most specific psychological profile, Poirot announced to our assembled company. We seek someone who is naturally left-handed but has learned to conceal this preference in social situations. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the hotel's layout and Sir Reuben's personal affairs. someone capable of sustained deception and theatrical performance. He held up the recovered fountain pen like a small but significant trophy. This pen was not lost accidentally. It was dropped during a moment of desperate action, when conscious control gave way to natural instinct. The left-handed attack, the left-handed writing, the left-handed defensive movement all reveal the same individual. The psychological pressure in the room was palpable. I could see the strain etched on several faces as the net of evidence tightened around our true quarry. The financial conspiracy exposed. The murder of Sir Reuben was not an isolated crime, Poirot continued, his voice gaining authority. It was the desperate conclusion of a 3-year conspiracy involving fraudulent mining ventures, manipulated bank accounts, and forged authorizations totaling nearly £500,000. He produced Miss Smallwood's ledger, its pages filled with meticulous documentation of the elaborate fraud. The person who killed Sir Reuben possessed not only the legal authority to authorize financial transactions on his behalf, but also the psychological leverage necessary to ensure his cooperation through blackmail and manipulation. The revelation sent visible shockwaves through our assembly. Mrs. Drake's face went pale as marble, while Anthony's cynical composure cracked entirely. The weight of financial ruin and criminal exposure hung in the air like a physical presence. The tightening net. The planted evidence against Mr. Vale was arranged with professional precision, Poirot revealed. The duplicated key, the forged receipts, the convenient telegram, all positioned where police investigation would inevitably discover them. This required not only criminal cunning but also intimate knowledge of investigative procedures. He paused, allowing his words to settle in the charged atmosphere. The burglary of Lady Imogen's salon was equally professional. Our thief knew exactly what documents to seek and where to find them. But they overlooked one crucial detail, the impressions left on the writing pad, beneath the stolen papers. From his coat pocket, he withdrew the rubbing that revealed the ghostly outlines of signatures and calculations. These impressions match the fraudulent authorizations documented in Miss Smallwood's ledger. They bear the signature of someone with power of attorney over Sir Reuben's affairs. Someone who had been systematically defrauding him for years. The chapter's climactic preparation. As the evening's revelations reached their crescendo, Poirot moved to his characteristic position near the fireplace, where the dancing flames cast dramatic shadows across his features while illuminating the faces of his suspects. "Tomorrow," he announced with that sense of theatrical timing that never failed to command attention, "we shall gather for the final confrontation. The evidence is complete, physical, psychological, and financial. The left-handed killer who wrote anonymous letters, planted evidence with meticulous care, and struck twice in desperation, will be exposed." He held up the fountain pen one final time, its silver surface catching the firelight like an accusation. "The serpent has struck again, mes amis, but in doing so has revealed the true nature of its coils. The smile that hides a wound, both literal and metaphorical, will be concealed no longer." The evening's resolution. As our suspects filed out of the lounge, each bearing the weight of their secrets and the fear of approaching exposure, I reflected that Poirot had successfully accomplished what Christie's detective always managed at this crucial stage. He had forced the killer into revealing action while simultaneously tightening the psychological and evidential net to its breaking point. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly as the last suspect departed. "The trap has been sprung, the evidence gathered, and the final piece of the puzzle secured. Tomorrow we shall see whether our killer's confidence in their elaborate deceptions was justified, or whether the methodical application of logic will prove stronger than even the most carefully constructed performance." The Palm Court fell silent, except for the distant melancholy of the pianist's final song. Somewhere among our elegant suspects, A left-handed killer was beginning to understand that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had uncovered not merely a crime of desperation, but a conspiracy of such scope and complexity that its exposure would reverberate through London's most respectable circles. The stage was set for the final revelation, and the serpent's coils were at last fully visible to those with eyes to see. The grey November morning settled over the Hotel Delphi with the weight of approaching resolution, and I found Hercule Poirot engaged in that familiar ritual of precise arrangement that indicated his little grey cells had reached a crucial juncture. On his writing table lay 3 objects arranged with mathematical exactitude: the silver fountain pen recovered from the Palm Court, a narrow strip of paper bearing faint impressions, and, most intriguingly, a single kid glove, left-handed, its fingers turned inside out like the petals of a wilted flower. "You have been busy, Poirot," I observed, noting the particular gleam in his eye that suggested a significant breakthrough. "But naturally, mon ami," he replied without looking up from his examination of the glove. "When a murderer commits a second desperate act, it is because their first precautions have failed. We look, therefore, for the failure that betrays." He touched the glove with delicate precision. "This, Hastings, is the small domestic detail that reveals the grand deception." Before I could inquire further, Inspector Japp entered with the satisfied air of a man whose patience has been rewarded. "Morning, Mr. Poirot. The hotel laundry forewoman confirms what you suspected. Someone sent a single glove for emergency cleaning after hours, with a generous tip to ensure discretion. Left-hand glove, kid leather, with a sticky residue along the inner seam. The forensic revelation." Poirot lifted the glove with the reverence of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. "Observe, mes amis, how the seam has stiffened where benzoin resin has penetrated the stitching. This was not applied for cosmetic purposes, but to secure a small dressing that must not come loose during an evening of social performance." He moved to his magnifying glass and invited us to examine the evidence more closely. "Note the pattern of staining, not random, but concentrated at the point where a bandage would press most firmly against the skin. Our killer sustained an injury, concealed it with theatrical skill, but could not entirely eliminate the physical evidence of their wound. The implications were staggering. Here was concrete proof that the murderer had been injured during the commission of their crime, had taken elaborate precautions to conceal that injury during the masquerade, and had been desperate enough to risk exposure by sending the incriminating glove for professional cleaning. The stationer's evidence. "Come," Poirot announced with sudden decision. "We have calls to make that will complete our understanding of this elaborate deception." Our first destination was the elegant establishment of S. Wainwright, stationers to discriminating ladies and gentlemen, where the brass fittings gleamed and the scent of fine paper created an atmosphere of literary refinement. A deferential clerk with an eyeglass examined the fountain pen with professional interest. "Left oblique number 5 nib, sir, with a specialized retipping," he confirmed. "Commissioned 3 months ago for a lady of particular requirements who complained of the inadequacy of standard nibs for her. Orientation. We fitted her with the oblique cut and provided a bottle of our distinctive emerald green ink." Poirot's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "And you maintain records of such specialized commissions?" "Naturally, sir. The account details are quite specific." The clerk produced a leather-bound ledger. "The lady was most insistent about the quality and paid a premium for the customization." The legal documentation. Our second call took us to the chambers of Messrs. Hartwell, Blackwood and Associates in Lincoln's Inn, where the managing partner received us with the grave courtesy due to a criminal investigation. The office possessed that peculiar atmosphere of legal authority. Leather-bound volumes, the scent of old parchment, and the weight of documented truth. "Sir Reuben's affairs," the solicitor explained after examining Poirot's credentials, "were indeed in a state of concerning complexity. 3 years ago, he executed a comprehensive power of attorney to facilitate certain business investments and to allow an authorized representative to act in his stead during his frequent travels. He produced a crisp vellum document from a secure file. The power of attorney granted broad financial authority to a single individual, someone Sir Reuben trusted implicitly with his most confidential affairs. Poirot studied the signature with intense concentration, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to the casual observer. Note Hastings, the distinctive backward slant of the terminal strokes, the peculiar formation of the capital letters. These are the unconscious habits of a lifetime, impossible to disguise completely even when one attempts to write in a more conventional manner. The hidden clue emerges. But most significantly, the solicitor continued, there were several unusual authorizations executed in the final weeks before Sir Reuben's death. Large transfers to accounts in Switzerland, the establishment of new shell companies, and most tellingly, the creation of a sealed packet of documents that Sir Reuben insisted must be kept secure at all costs. Poirot's attention sharpened immediately. This sealed packet, it was among the items stolen from Lady Imogen's salon. Indeed, Sir Reuben had grown increasingly paranoid about its security. He told me it contained evidence that would destroy someone he had trusted completely, if it ever came to light. The packet was sealed with his personal signet and marked with instructions that it should only be opened in the event of his death or disappearance. Here was the hidden clue that had eluded us. Sir Reuben had prepared for his own murder by creating a posthumous accusation against his killer. The burglary of Lady Imogen's salon had not been random theft, but a desperate attempt to retrieve and destroy evidence that would have exposed the murderer's identity beyond all doubt. The psychological trap. Returning to the hotel, Poirot moved with the purposeful energy of a chess master preparing his final gambit. We shall arrange one more gathering, Hastings, but this time with a difference. I shall request that each person provide a sample of their handwriting, ostensibly for the completion of police records, but actually to observe their natural writing habits under pressure. He arranged a writing table with characteristic precision, placing upon it several sheets of fine paper, a selection of pens including one with a left oblique nib, and most significantly, a bottle of the distinctive green ink that had appeared in the anonymous letters. The killer believes they have successfully destroyed all evidence of their guilt, Poirot explained, but they cannot destroy the unconscious habits that betray the true nature of their dominant hand, their natural writing style, or their familiarity with the very materials used in their elaborate deception. The final psychological pressure. As our suspects gathered in the Red Salon for what they believed would be a routine administrative procedure, I observed the subtle signs of strain that indicated the psychological pressure had reached its breaking point. The request for handwriting samples created an atmosphere of barely controlled tension. Mrs. Drake's hand trembled slightly as she approached the writing table, while Anthony Drake's usual cynical confidence showed visible cracks. Miss Ray maintained her professional composure, but I noticed her eyes lingered on the left oblique pen with unmistakable recognition. Mr. Vale, though cleared of murder charges, bore the hollow expression of a man who had glimpsed financial ruin. The revelation approaches. Tomorrow, Poirot announced as the handwriting samples were completed, we shall gather for the final revelation. The hidden clue has been discovered, the physical evidence assembled, and the psychological portrait completed. The person who murdered Sir Reuben Drake, who orchestrated a 3-year conspiracy of fraud and manipulation, who planted evidence to condemn an innocent man, and who attempted a second murder to preserve their secret, will be exposed. He held up the recovered glove one final time, its stained seam catching the firelight like an accusation. The smile that hides a wound, mes amis, both literal and metaphorical, will be concealed no longer. The elaborate performance that has deceived society, the police, and even the victim himself is about to reach its final, devastating conclusion. The chapter's resolution. As our suspects departed, each bearing the weight of their secrets and the growing certainty that exposure was imminent, I reflected that Poirot had successfully accomplished what Christie's detective always managed at this crucial juncture. He had discovered the one piece of evidence that the killer, believed safely destroyed, had applied scientific method to psychological analysis, and had created the conditions necessary for a final, irrefutable revelation. "Come, Hastings," he said quietly as the salon emptied. "The hidden clue has served its purpose. Sir Reuben's posthumous accusation, combined with the physical evidence of injury and the psychological evidence of elaborate deception, has created a web from which our killer cannot escape. Tomorrow, the methodical application of logic will prove stronger than even the most carefully constructed performance." The evening settled over the Hotel Delphi with the weight of approaching justice. Somewhere among our elegant suspects, a murderer was beginning to understand that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells had uncovered not merely the crime itself, but the entire architecture of deception that had made it possible. The stage was set for the final revelation, and the hidden clue that would expose the truth had been discovered at last. The grey November evening settled over the Hotel Delphi with the weight of approaching justice, and the red salon possessed that charged stillness I have come to associate with Poirot's revelations, a silence so taut it might snap under the weight of a single syllable. The crimson walls seemed to pulse with expectancy, while the fire threw up a low, even flame that cast dancing shadows across the faces of our assembled suspects. Hercule Poirot had arranged the chairs in his characteristic semicircle with mathematical precision, each position calculated to create the perfect theatre of truth. At his side, a small table bore 3 objects arranged like chessmen before the final move: the benzoin-stained glove, the silver fountain pen with its distinctive left oblique nib, and the faint impression strip that had preserved the ghostly evidence of guilt. Inspector Japp stood with folded arms by the door, his expression indicating he knew the next hour would settle everything. Our company entered with varying degrees of unease. Mrs. Adela Drake pale as the pearls at her throat, Anthony Drake with his cynical bravado quite spent, Lionel Vale wan and watchful after his wrongful arrest, Miss Celia Ray maintaining her professional composure like a statue carved from jet, Miss Vera Smallwood mouse quiet and tight about the mouth, and Mr. Lawrence Bligh perspiring despite the evening's chill. The methodical revelation. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying clearly through the salon's charged atmosphere. "At midnight on the evening of Lady Imogen's masquerade, Sir Reuben Drake died by a left-handed blow, precise and economical. He was a man encircled by fraud, manipulated by someone he trusted completely, and he was about to speak the truth that would have destroyed his killer. That is why he was murdered." He gestured to Dr. Morehouse, who confirmed once more the downward, left-angled trajectory of the blade. "The wound tells us much about our killer. Someone who struck from close proximity with surgical precision, using their dominant left hand, despite years of training to conceal this natural preference." Poirot's gaze returned to the semicircle of suspects. The investigation began with an anonymous letter predicting Sir Reuben's death. A letter written by Miss Smallwood in a desperate attempt to warn both her employer and myself of the danger she sensed, but could not yet prove. Her meticulous ledger, stolen during the burglary of Lady Imogen's salon, documented a 3-year conspiracy of systematic fraud totaling nearly £500,000. The physical evidence. The mask found in the cloakroom bore traces of benzoin tincture and theatrical adhesive. Poirot continued, lifting the stained mask with delicate precision. Someone at the masquerade was concealing a physical wound, an injury sustained while practicing the precise motion required for murder. This wound required elaborate concealment throughout an evening of social interaction. He held up the kid glove with its telltale staining. This left-handed glove was sent for emergency cleaning, bearing the same benzoin traces. The pattern of staining indicates a dressing secured at the point where a wound would be most vulnerable to detection. The hotel laundry confirmed it came from Suite 312. The psychological pressure in the room was palpable as Poirot lifted the silver fountain pen. The attempted murder of Miss Smallwood in the Palm Court revealed our killer's desperation and confirmed their dominant hand. This specialized left oblique nib pen, commissioned 3 months ago from a Bond Street stationer, along with distinctive emerald green ink, was dropped during that desperate struggle. The financial conspiracy. The person who murdered Sir Reuben possessed comprehensive power of attorney over his affairs, Poirot revealed, producing the legal document. This authority, granted 3 years ago, allowed systematic manipulation of his accounts through shell companies and Swiss bank transfers. The sealed packet Sir Reuben left with Lady Imogen contained his own investigation into this betrayal, a posthumous accusation against someone he had trusted with his life. He displayed the rubbing taken from Lady Imogen's writing pad. The impressions left beneath the stolen documents reveal not only the familiar green ink, but also signatures with distinctive characteristics, the backward slant of terminal strokes, the peculiar formation of capital letters. These are unconscious habits of a lifetime, impossible to disguise completely even when attempting conventional penmanship. The psychological portrait. Our killer possessed a unique combination of skills, Poirot continued, his voice gaining authority. Financial expertise to orchestrate complex fraud, legal authority to act without suspicion, psychological manipulation to control Sir Reuben through blackmail, and theatrical ability to maintain perfect social facades while harboring murderous intent. They could plant evidence with professional precision, the convenient receipts in Mr. Vale's belongings, the duplicated key, the forged telegram, all positioned where police investigation would inevitably discover them. He began his familiar, measured pacing. But most significantly, our killer underestimated the persistence of methodical investigation and the tendency of elaborate deceptions to collapse under their own complexity. The left-handed writing, the specialized pen, the benzoin-stained glove, the power of attorney, the financial motive, all point inexorably to one individual. The moment of truth. Poirot's penetrating gaze settled on Mrs. Adela Drake, whose widow's composure had grown increasingly brittle as the evidence mounted. The handwriting analysis confirms what the physical evidence suggested, madame. Your left-handed script, despite years of training to write conventionally, betrays itself in the anonymous letters, the forged authorizations, and the calculations recovered from Lady Imogen's salon. The silence stretched like a taut wire, and then Mrs. Drake rose from her chair with the dignity of one who has finally decided to abandon a performance that has grown too heavy to sustain. "You are correct, Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the salon's charged atmosphere. "I killed my husband." The complete confession. The admission sent a collective gasp through the assembled company, but Mrs. Drake continued with growing strength, her grief-stricken widow facade finally discarded to reveal the calculating intelligence beneath. Reuben had discovered my financial arrangements, she explained with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman discussing household expenses. 3 years of careful planning, of building security while he squandered our resources on foolish ventures and romantic notions of business honor. The power of attorney was legitimate. He trusted me completely with his affairs. It was simple to establish shell companies, create Swiss accounts, build a structure that would survive his inevitable failures. Her composure was remarkable and chilling. The anonymous letters were my final attempt to give him a chance to cooperate quietly. But he had grown suspicious, started investigating, threatened to involve authorities. The sealed packet he left with Lady Imogen would have destroyed everything I'd worked to build. Anthony Drake's face had gone white as parchment. "Aunt Adela, good Lord, but you seemed so devoted." She smiled then, a small, chilling curve that revealed the true nature beneath the performance. "Devotion, my dear Anthony, takes many forms. I was devoted to ensuring our family's survival, even when your uncle's conscience threatened to destroy us all." The technical execution. The masquerade provided perfect cover, she continued with something approaching professional pride. I practiced for weeks with a letter opener, but the blade was sharper than expected. I cut myself during the final rehearsal and had to devise the benzoin concealment at the last moment. The theatrical training from my youth proved invaluable. Poirot nodded gravely. The evidence against Mr. Vale was planted with meticulous care. The duplicated key receipt, the sealing wax mold, the convenient telegram. You understood that his reputation depended on the copper venture's success, making him the obvious suspect when fraud was revealed. Lionel was perfect for the role, she confirmed. His cowardice in business dealings made him vulnerable to suspicion, and his panic when questioned only confirmed what everyone would naturally assume. The final irony. But you underestimated two crucial factors, Poirot observed with quiet satisfaction. First, the persistence of methodical investigation that looks beyond convenient solutions to psychological truth. And second, your husband's own intelligence. He had prepared for his murder by creating evidence that would expose you posthumously. Mrs. Drake's composure finally showed cracks around the edges. Reuben was always more clever than he appeared. I should have anticipated that he would prepare for the possibility of betrayal, even from his own wife. Justice served. Inspector Japp stepped forward, but Mrs. Drake raised her hand with quiet dignity. That won't be necessary, Inspector. I have no intention of creating a scene. I have played my part to its conclusion, and the performance is over. As she was led away, her bearing remained erect and composed. A woman who had gambled everything on an elaborate deception and lost, but who retained the dignity of one who had at least played the game with considerable skill. The resolution? So ends, Poirot said quietly as the salon emptied. One of the most psychologically complex cases I've encountered. A murder that was simultaneously a crime of calculated greed and desperate self-preservation, committed by someone who possessed both the emotional motivation of financial fear and the technical skills of a professional manipulator. He straightened the objects on his small table so that glove, pen, and paper lay in perfect alignment. Order restored from chaos, truth extracted from deception. The smile that hides a wound, he murmured to me as we prepared to depart. Both literal and metaphorical, mon ami. Mrs. Drake concealed her physical injury with theatrical skill, but she could not conceal the deeper wound of a nature capable of murdering the man who trusted her completely. The red salon fell silent, except for the crackling fire and the distant sounds of London beyond the hotel's windows. Justice had been served through methodical investigation and psychological insight, proving once again that no deception, however elaborate, could withstand the persistent application of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells to the pursuit of truth. "Come, Hastings," he said, with characteristic authority. "The case is concluded, the geometry of truth restored. Tomorrow we return to the comfortable chaos of ordinary life, leaving behind only the satisfaction that justice has prevailed over even the most carefully constructed performance.